50 days after the resurrection of Jesus, Jews from the lands all around the eastern Mediterranean were gathering in great excitement to celebrate their ancient Festival of Weeks in Jerusalem. It would have been a truly joyous occasion, just as the Jewish bar mitzvah celebrations are in the Holy City today. The vast throng had gathered from an enormous area around the Mediterranean, a truly multicultural crowd. And this was the opportunity chosen by God to pour out his Spirit on his first disciples, giving them the power to announce the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And this in the very city which had crucified him only 50 days earlier. Peter's astounding message to the enormous crowd was, "You killed him, God raised him, we are witnesses." And about 3,000 were deeply convicted and believed his message. They will be returning to their various lands as the very first believers in Jesus, as the Jewish Messiah and as the Son of God. Some of them would be making their way home to the extraordinary land of Cappadocia. Driving through Cappadocia is like travelling back in time. This is the land of the Hittites. They established their empire here about 1600 BC. The astounding fairy chimneys are one of the world's most stunning sights. This landscape was created about 13 million years ago when erupting volcanoes blanketed the region with ash. The ash solidified into an easily eroded material called tufa, overlaid in places by layers of hard volcanic rock. Over time, the tufa was worn away, creating these distinctive formations, including the capped cone fairy chimneys. So it was to this remarkable land that some of its residents returned from Jerusalem as some of the earliest believers in Jesus as the Jewish Messiah and the Son of God. But back at Jerusalem, not everyone shared their faith. One of the believers' fiercest opponents was Saul, later known by his Roman name of Paul. He was a strictly religious Jew, brought up to observe the requirements of the law in the most intimate detail. Today, at Jerusalem's famous Western Wall, the intensity of Jewish prayers and rituals provides a dramatic insight into the intensity of Paul himself. He knew that this Jesus had been crucified for claiming to be the Messiah. And now his followers were claiming that God had raised him from the dead in dramatic confirmation that he was indeed the Messiah. To Paul, such a fervent Jew, it was intolerable. How could this Jesus be the long-awaited Messiah? His tomb was certainly empty. Everyone in Jerusalem knew that. The stone had been rolled away and the body gone. But it was all a massive deception by his disciples, surely. They'd doubtless stolen his body and were now claiming he was alive. What's more, many thousands were believing them. This deceit would be spreading ever further. It must be halted at all costs. One of Jesus' followers had already been stoned to death. Stephen, the very first Christian martyr. As the rocks rained down on him, Stephen prayed, "Lord, don't hold this sin against them." And Saul was present to see him die. He, for one, could never forget it. Stephen's death triggered a great persecution. Several of the believers had to flee for their lives, many as far as Damascus. So Saul set off in hot pursuit, determined to destroy this new movement. So out of the city and across the Kidron Valley, past the Garden of Gethsemane. Oh my word, this was where Jesus had been arrested. The whole city knew all about that. And then on up to the top of the Mount of Olives. Time for a last long lingering look at Jerusalem behind him. The road now tumbled down through the awesome Judean wilderness to the bottom of the Great Rift Valley, the lowest place on earth, nearly 1,400 feet or 423 metres below sea level. The temperature soars, and so did Saul's anger.
They thought they could escape him, did they? Little did they know that he was after them. But then, could it be that someone might be after him?
He's arrived at Jericho, the city of palm trees, set in its lush oasis with the Judean wilderness all around. But, oh no, it was from here that Jesus had set out for Jerusalem on his fateful visit. They'd turned against him pretty quickly when he'd invited himself to the home of the most hated man in town, Jericho's chief tax collector, Zacchaeus.
The man who worked for the hated Romans and had defrauded just about everyone in town. Well, didn't that just go to show what rogues these followers of Jesus were? Just like their master. Risen from the dead, had he? Well, if that tomb was empty, his followers must have spirited away his corpse somewhere. No wonder they were still at it. But not for very much longer. He, Saul, was personally going to put an end to this matter, once and for all.
Where next? Yes, Beit Abara, the crossing point on the Jordan. It's here that great crowds had flocked to hear the great preacher from the wilderness who'd caused such a stir. John the Baptizer, they'd called him. Thousands had flocked to hear him. The chief priests had even had to send out messengers to ask him who he thought he was.
Are you the Messiah, they'd asked? No, he'd answered, but someone's coming after me who's far greater than I. I'm here to prepare the way for the Lord.
So in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens opened and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "Thou art my beloved Son. With thee I am well pleased." And so this was where he'd actually baptized this Jesus. Here today, where the Jordan used to flow, steps from the earliest churches lead down to this never-to-be-forgotten site. The very first church on these pillars actually spanned the river itself. So this is a site where the ministry of Jesus began.
There was just no getting round it. There was no escaping this Jesus. Every mile of Saul's journey was rooted in memories of him. Almost as if Jesus was dogging his steps, you might say.
Up north now towards Galilee, and there's its glorious lake. But, oh dear, the whole life of Jesus had revolved around this lake, hadn't it? He had called his first disciples on its shores, and great crowds had flocked to hear him on its surrounding hills. Which route around the lake did Saul take? We're not told. If he went west, he'd have passed Tabgha, where even today its church commemorates how Jesus fed the 5,000 with just 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Its famous mosaic is a small, simple but eloquent testimony to the miracle which took place. If Saul had taken the eastern shore, he'd have heard how a great crowd of 4,000 had spent 3 days there with Jesus in these hills, enthralled by his teaching. He had fed them with just 7 loaves and a few fish. A few miles further on, they'd all have been telling him of how this Jesus had driven evil spirits out of a man. He'd sent them into a herd of pigs who had all rushed over the cliffs and drowned in the lake. Jesus didn't seem so popular there. In fact, they'd told him to go away. If only he could shake these memories of Jesus from him.
He's nearly at the top of the lake now. Peace at last. But, oh no, it's Capernaum, the home of that man Peter.
Why, Jesus had made this fishing town the centre of his Galilean ministry for nearly 3 whole years. Just about everything had happened here. The stories were endless. It's here, in Peter's house, that Jesus had claimed to have the authority to forgive sins, something only God could do. Sheer blasphemy. No wonder he had had to be crucified. That wretched Jairus, the very ruler of the synagogue. The whole town was emphatic that Jesus had raised his daughter from the dead. Saul couldn't have got out of the town quick enough. The memories of Jesus would be suffocating him.
So off he sets, leaving Capernaum and the lakeside far behind and heading north towards the city of Caesarea Philippi on the very foothills of Mount Hermon.
Beneath these towering cliffs, the melted snows of Mount Hermon flow out of the rock as a complete river, one of the sources of the River Jordan. This unusual natural phenomenon had caused this place to be a centre of pagan religion from earliest times. And it was here that Jesus had come with his disciples. And at this very site, where men had worshipped their heathen deities, Jesus had asked them, "Who do you say I am?" Peter's reply was destined to ring down through the ages. "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Saul would have shuddered at such a reply. But today's visitors, in remembering this event, find the reply of Jesus to Simon Peter very telling. "Blessed are you, Simon, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." So here, at one of the sources of the River Jordan, Simon Peter had been granted a revelation as to the true identity of Jesus. But would a similar revelation ever be granted to Saul? He was about to set off on this, the final stage of his journey to Damascus. Little did he know it, but it was about to change his life and world history forever.